Hello and welcome everyone to another episode of React WooCommerce theme development with REST API. In the previous video, we built this entire form and then selection of these input countries, etc., and showing of this order data, etc. Now we're going to do the checkout. Basically, we're going to do the Stripe later, but first we're going to handle these types of modes of payment. So what we're going to do is we'll create an endpoint for create order. And then once the order is created, then we're going to get the redirect URL for payment, and we're going to redirect the user to that payment gateway. But for Stripe, we're going to handle everything on our own using Stripe API. Okay, so let's do the other payment modes first. So I'm going to go over here and I'm going to go to the API, and under API we'll create a file called create order. Okay, and I'll paste a code snippet and I'll explain to you what that does. So here we have the Next.js public URL. So here we are basically using the WooCommerce REST API, which I've already explained to you in the previous episodes, which we use to basically get the products. And then we are using this API and passing the URL, the WordPress site URL, the consumer key, the consumer secret, which you've already defined in the .env file, version 3. And then we are creating this handler for this API. And this handler is going to basically take the request and generate the response. The response is going to include the response data, success, whether false or true, order ID, total, currency, error. And it's also going to include the payment URL. We'll say that if the request.body is empty, then required data is not sent, and we'll just return the response data, which will be this empty value. But if that's not the case, if we have the body, then we're going to set the status of the payment to pending, and we'll set paid to false. And then we'll go ahead and make a post request to orders. Basically, if you go to this URL, WooCommerce create an order, so open this up. There you will have all of the information of what all data is required to basically access this endpoint, right? So you can see you basically use the post request and you send that to orders, and you're going to get this kind of a response. So you can go there and you can check all that option. Okay, so that's what we're doing here. We are passing this request.body, and of course we're going to construct our data in this format and then pass it to this particular endpoint. This is our own endpoint, which is calling another endpoint, which is orders, which belongs to the WooCommerce REST API. And then once we get the data, once we get the response, we set the success to true. We put the order number, the total value, the currency, payment URL, all of that information. In case there's any error, then we send that error. Okay, so we built our endpoint. Now we just have to call it. So we'll go back to our checkout form, which is our main function, and here is where we'll handle the submit form. Now this is going to be an async await one. This is going to need the event. We'll do event.prevent default because I don't want default browser behavior for the form submit. I want to handle it on my own. Now before we actually call that endpoint, we also need to check if there are any errors. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. So I'm going to copy this code, paste it here, and I'll explain to you what's going on there. So if you're going to check the billing validation result, we'll check shipping validation result. If there's any error in either of those, then we're going to just return null. We're not going to proceed further. And also we're going to set the errors to the input in the billing and the shipping respectively. Now how are we going to do that? We're going to do that using this function, which is validate and sanitize checkout form. And we'll create that function inside of, we'll create a directory called validator. And inside of this, we'll create a file called checkout because this is related to checkout. We'll keep everything related to the checkout inside of that file. And then basically take this whole thing and paste it here. And we're going to install the validator. So let's install npm install validator. And we also need to create our own empty isEmpty function. So we'll create a file called isEmpty.js and we'll paste that there. So this just returns true if the value is undefined, null, empty object, or empty string. This is our own empty isEmpty function. I mean, you could use the Lodash also. It's completely up to you. All right, so what's happening there here? So basically it takes data, it handles the states differently if you're passing states value. It initializes the errors and sanitized data variables as empty objects first. And then it takes the data. So remember, we're passing the initial data over here as your first name, last name, all of those things under billing shipping. So it gets access to that from the input, and then it checks if it's empty or not and sets these values. Then it checks for error if it's required is true. So for certain type of data, for example, for email, the validator npm package, if you go and check the validator npm package, you'll see that it's got lots of handy functions for checking the email validation, for checking the phone number validation. So it's pretty good actually. Just look at this weekly downloads on that one, and there's so many contributors for this one. It's pretty useful for checking your postcode, checking his boolean, credit card, currency, just so many useful functions available. So rather than handling those things on our own, if something is available, we can utilize that. Okay, so that's what we are doing basically over here. We are checking, so we've created a function, internal function called add error and sanitize data. It basically takes the field name, whether it's name, email, or whatever that is, error content, minimum and max, type, required or not, and basis that it goes and adds the error. Like if whatever error content we pass must be within that this to that range. This is not valid, phone number is not valid, required is not valid. So it adds that. But if there are no errors, then it passes the sanitized data. Let's say sanitized name, sanitized email, sanitized phone number. It goes ahead and uses the validator.trim to trim the name, normalizes the email, right, and escapes any unwanted characters. So it does all of the escaping, because remember in PHP we can do it, but we have to ensure that the data we are sending it to our endpoint, our WordPress, needs to be sanitized on JavaScript level as well. So it gives you that ability to do the sanitization validation for your data. Okay, and then all we do is, because we created this handy function, we're just calling that function on all of those fields with different values. Every time we can change the error content, we can change the min and max values, we can change the type, we can say if it's required or not required. And accordingly, this function is going to handle that, because it accepts those parameters and is going to handle by setting those errors, or if there are no errors, it's just going to sanitize those values and put that in the sanitized data. Okay, and then finally, it goes ahead and returns that data over here. If there are no errors, then it just says is valid equals true. All right, so that's all that is happening over there. Okay, now if you come over here and see if it's handling that. So I'm going to just import this function on top. So I'll say form, so import validation and sanitize checkout form. Okay, great. Now let's take a look. So if I don't fill these guys, if I don't fill these these input fields, so notice what happens. You have the first name not required, last name required, country name required, street address required. So what all of these fields required, right? So, but if I fill this correctly, you'll notice that that will go, that went off, right? If I put email, now it's saying that you have to include, of course, at. So that's not taking that, not valid. So even though I'm saying SD as the at, a normal browser behavior would have been, it would accept that as a valid email, but it knows it's not valid, right? So I have to put the valid email. So now it's going to take that. Phone number, if I put it like that, it's not going to take it. It's saying phone number not valid. So say 99. If I put an extra digit, no. Put an extra digit, no. It went, yeah. Similarly, postcode, city, all of those fields, the moment you fill it correctly, those errors are going to go. And why are we able to see this is because, remember, in that input component that we created, we are using this error function, right? It basically passes if there are any errors in the input field. The moment there's an error, so notice if I open this and I open the shipping, See, all those errors have been added here. So you have address error, you have city error, the last name error, postcode error, all of those errors. And the moment I add correct information, that error, one of those errors will go off. So now if I check under shipping, there's no last name error anymore, right? So that's where it's pulling that information from. The one at the bottom, that those are below the input field. So if there are any errors, it's going to pick up that and it's going to know the field name. So field name is already available, right? So whatever field name this is, we have that available, which is the name of this field, whatever that name is of this input. So with that name, it's going to pick up that information and it's going to render that over here. And that's pretty useful. The moment the errors become 0, it's not going to render anything then. That's pretty powerful. So that's reusability. I love it. Great. So that's it for this video. In the next video, we'll continue further in using our create order API that we had created, and we'll continue further. So I hope you did like the video. If you did, please give a thumbs up and do subscribe to my channel if you aren't already. And do hit the super thanks button to support my work, and follow me on GitHub. My GitHub handle is imranhsayed, and follow me on Twitter. My Twitter handle is Codeytek. So I'm going to see you in the next video. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.